Hello, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Nessa, and I am an indie author, and I publish under the pen name A.N. Sage. I write fantasy, sci-fi, and pretty much all things paranormal. And if you're into that kind of thing, then make sure to subscribe so you can see more videos on some of my tips and tricks, some behind the scenes, and a whole bunch of planning and plotting, because yes, I am very much a planner. So in today's video, we are continuing the world building series that we've been going on about for quite some time now. We only have about 2 videos left in it. And today we're talking about world building on the part of politics. So if you're wondering how to set up a political system in your fantasy or sci-fi or any other kind of story really, then make sure to stick around, because we'll be back in just a moment with some tips from my experience on building different fantasy worlds. And we are back with our world building series. We are talking about politics, as I mentioned in the introduction, and I'm pretty excited to talk about this. We did talk about magic systems in last week's videos, and if you haven't seen that yet, I will link it just above so you can see what that was all about, because that was a really fun one. And today we are back with the more serious side of world building. It doesn't have to be for a fantasy world or a sci-fi world. Again, like I mentioned in the intro, you can use these tips for building a political system in pretty much any kind of fiction setting. For me, I write mostly fantasy and sci-fi, and so that's how I'm going to be speaking about it. But again, if I say something that's not related to your genre, just scratch out that fantasy part or whatever it is and keep on watching, because the actual tips and advice are relevant to pretty much anything that has to do with building politics as part of your world. And so the first thing, and we're just gonna, like, as always, dive right in, because I don't tittle tattle. I mean, I didn't at first when I first started this channel, but now I'm straight to the point, and I think it just works better, is that you need to consider that your story will define the politics in your world. So depending on how you're going to tell your story or what the plot of your story is, that's how your political system will develop and be created. It will have to be this way because it really needs to relate in very much depth to your actual storyline. Now, your story might not have anything to do with politics or anything like that, but you have to consider that some sort of political system needs to exist, because that is just the way things work, right? There is always some kind of governing force behind reality and life. And so that's what the political system is. Now, when I say politics and world building, I don't necessarily mean like you have like presidents or kings or whatever. Politics can come in many different forms. Your politics in your story, if you're writing fantasy, witchy story, for example, it could be the politics within a coven, right? So it's not a king or queen, a president, or whoever else, right, is in charge. The coven itself will have inner politics. And so your politics don't have to relate to your entire world at large. It can be a very succinct small group of individuals and the politics between them. You could have political systems that are between friends, right? Different groups. If you're writing a high school story, right? Cliques, that's politics. That's politics on a smaller scale. And so you really need to understand that whatever story that you're writing, it's going to define how grandiose your politics systems will be. And it will give you kind of a starting point from which to plan. As always, I should say, not everything you plan, write out, then take notes on, figure out in your head, not everything's going to end up on the page. It shouldn't. Most of it should be kind of behind the doors and just for you, but you should know what's going on, because just with like characters and the world itself and magic system and all of that other stuff we talked about, you knowing more cannot hurt. It's going to help you write in a more succinct, more realistic, sorry, My accent always coming out for playing fun. But it will help you write a more realistic story, something more believable, because you will write as someone who knows your world. And the political system is no exception to that. You should know it. You should know how it works. And so once you know what kind of story you have, take a look at the political kind of nuances that you already have behind it and go from there, because that's what's going to define your starting point. And once you know what kind of system you have in place, you want to think about the history of that system, the evolution of it. Also, I apologize if you can hear like a hum in the background. That my MacBook is right behind me. And for anybody who owns a MacBook knows that when they're doing something else, it's like a rocket ship taking off. It's so loud. So I'm going to try to get rid of it in post edits. But if you can hear it, I apologize, such is life, technology. But yeah, so history, right? The history of your political system and how it evolved. Much like everything else that we've discussed, it couldn't have just come out of nowhere. And so it had to gradually have been created. You want to really take notes on this and figure that part out. You want to figure out like what that Big Bang kind of moment was when it all came together, what started it and why it started to progress and move along. Were there other people that came into play? Were there wars? Was there famine? Was there poverty? Was there a revolution of some sort? All of these things will feed into your system and develop it and create what you will have eventually be ending up with. And that's kind of, you want to play with that, right? Like you want to start at the beginning and move over, because you will put the meat on the bones of your political system that way, because you'll know how it came about, and it will help you set some rules, which we'll talk about very soon. And the reason you want that, and that's kind of like the next point, is that you want a political system that feels real and that feels consistent, right? So if something happens in your world, if something happens to your characters, or if they find themselves in a certain situation, it needs to be consistent with these rules and settings that you've given yourself based on how this political system works, how it progressed to become what it is today. Let's say you are creating a world where thievery is fine. Everybody steals from each other, right? And so all of a sudden you write something and your character does something pretty awful, and they get punished for it. And it's, if they can steal and they can do all this other stuff and that's fine, why are they getting punished for this particular thing? I mean, that was just a random foolish example, but you have to think of it that way, right? Like, what are the rules and the laws that your political system has in place that are absolutely cannot be broken, rules that are gray areas, can be broken but are frowned upon, things like that. And you really need to have that down on paper, because as your character is doing things, they're not operating in a void, right? Like they're not just like going about and saving the world or whatever it is they're doing without outside influence. And their actions don't just disappear; they cause a ripple effect into other characters, into the world around them. And so you really need to kind of figure out what binds this whole world together. And oftentimes, the political system that you create will be that binding agent, and it will be exactly what you need to kind of steer your character on the path that they need to go on. And so for it to feel real, your reader has to believe that there is a reason in place for your political system. They have to feel like if they were in this world, they would understand how to navigate this system. They would know, like, for example, if you have kings and queens, right? Like they would know that this hierarchy works because of A, B, C, and D, because you've laid out these terms of why it's important to have like a king or a queen, and why it's important to have an army behind them, and what other areas in the world there are that might not have a king and a queen, and what the conflict is between these areas. So all these little details, they'll help your political system really feel as realistic as the one that we live in today, right? And even in our world today, there's so many different political systems on different scales, right? But they all feel real. Because they are real, but also because we know how they work, right? And so you should know how that your system works in order to actually put it down on paper in a consistent and believable and realistic way. The main part of the meat of your political system are really just the parties and the factions that are a part of it. And these are very important to think about. They're important to kind of dissect and get the details and notes on, because they're really what's going to drive your political system. They're kind of the atlas holding up the world in a way. And so you want to think about all the different factions. And so what I usually do is I kind of sit down and I brainstorm and I write down every single possible party or faction that I can think of. In the world that I'm writing in now, I'm going to try to say this without giving spoilers, but I mean, not really, because I haven't talked about it at all. It's a small town, but there's politics within the small town, right? So you have like your regular sheriff or your police force, there's the lawyers, there's the mayor, but then there's also this environmental group, this aspect of the town that everybody kind of shuns and doesn't like, because they cause a lot of chaos due to their beliefs and things they're trying to accomplish for the town. And so I've laid out all these different factions, and I'm not sure if all of them will be used or how much of an impact they'll have on the actual novel, but I know that they're there. And in doing so, I actually discovered that this political group, when I was this environmental group, when I was developing them, they're not going to be a huge part of the whole story. However, because of how I've developed them and just thinking of what they do and who they are, I was able to add more to the plot and to change the plot around. And there was actually a portion in the story that I was not confused about, but something just wasn't clicking. You know, when you're trying to put together a plot and it just isn't sitting well for some reason. Well, a part of what wasn't sitting well came to me because I started thinking about the politics in this environmental group and how they fit into the rest of the town. And I wouldn't have gotten there if I didn't think of it, if I didn't try to develop a political system that was realistic, like we talked about before. And so when you're thinking about these parties and factions, you really want to put yourself in their shoes and try to figure out, like, what is it that divides all the different factions that you have in your story. Like, what separates them? Why are there so many factions? Otherwise it would just be like one big utopia, right? But why there's so many, what their beliefs are, why those beliefs are different from one another, and going back to the history, how these different factions came about. You want to think about how power is distributed. So you really want to consider who has more power, who has less. For a political system to be real, there always is more power on some parts than another, right? Because again, not utopian, unless you're writing a utopian novel. But really, there has to be some kind of conflict, right? And more power and less power is usually a very standard, very basic, but very concrete and good conflict to have in a political system. And so you want to figure out how that power in your world gets distributed between these different factions. And then you also want to think about who chooses these leaders, right? Is there a vote? Is there, like, are you writing like a shifter novel where the alpha chooses somebody, or the alpha is this main person, and things like that? Like, you just want to think about kind of who chooses the leaders, what that process is, and really define it for yourself, because it might come into play. You don't know. It might actually lead your story in one way or another. And you want to think about what would prevent the abuse of power. Because if you don't think about this one part, I can guarantee you that not only will your political system not be like realistic, because really there's always rules and laws in place, but you're going to write yourself into a very odd corner, because you might have this villain, this antagonist that you're writing, and they might do something. And if you haven't written any laws for the prevention of power and abuse of power, what's to stop them from taking over the world or killing your protagonist on the first page, right? Your reader might not believe that so much, right? There has to be a reason why the world, your world that you're writing, why it hasn't ended yet, right? And so the preventing an abuse of power within your political system is important. It's very important, because much like every other real political system, you would have that in place. There would be checks in place to prevent like a big world war, right? And so you want to consider that as well for your different factions and how they operate between each other. You also want to consider economy, right? And our last video for the series next week will be on economy in different fantasy and fictional and sci-fi worlds. But your economy will affect your politics, right? So the way that money is operated, the way that money moves your world, it will create a different political system. In any world, really, money or some kind of economy, it doesn't have to be like financial, it could be trades, it could be magic trades, whatever it is. There's power in that, right? And power develops politics. It's just how it generally works, right? And so you really want to think about what your economy is, and not so much in the detail of the economy for this particular section of world building, but how it affects your politics. For example, if you have a trades system, right? Is there one area in your world that might have more resources than another? Do they then use that to their advantage to kind of become this monopoly on resources? Does that give them more power in politics? Are they the big bad? Are they the big good, right? Things like that you want to take into consideration. If you're writing on a smaller scale, let's take a look at that high school we kind of chatted about like earlier. Are there rich kids or the poor kids, right? And do the rich kids have more power in the school? Are their cliques feared? Their groups, are they feared? Do they control the other students, right? And so every section, no matter how big your political system is, some sort of economy will play a factor in it, because I mean, that's just how politics really work in a way. There's going to be a play for power somewhere in there. And that power comes from an economical standpoint. If it's in a coven, right? Are there certain witches who are stronger, who have more magic? How do they use that? Where does that put them in the political sense of that coven? Are they the high priestesses? Is there only one? Do they have a queen of some sort? Like what is it, or goddess, or whatever it is? Like what is it that creates factions based on economy, which then creates politics, right? So starting from the financial, put this on it because it doesn't have to be money, like we said, but starting from that point and moving outward is also something that you really want to think about when you're like planning out your political system. And then last, but of course not least, is details. Details. You don't have to go crazy with them. Of course, obviously, nobody is gonna, after you write this book, we're not gonna all of a sudden go out and put this political system into the world, and now this is how we operate our world. It's a story, right? But you wanna have the details in place, in your head at least. You wanna think about how debates take place, right? That's a pretty big one in politics, because that's usually governed or sanctioned somehow. You wanna think about if there's meetings, right? Let's say you're writing a supernatural world, right? And you have all these different types of species. Do they have meetings between their different species types where the representatives meet? When they happen, how they happen, what happens, what gets discussed, all of those little details, right? You want to have that in place. Even if you don't necessarily use it in your story, I still like to think about that stuff. I might not go into crazy detail unless my story really touches on those meetings, but I'll have an idea of how it works, because again, it rounds the political world. And then you also want to think about the advantages and disadvantages to being a politician. Why is it good to be one of these leaders, factions, or somebody else in that world? Why is it bad? Is it dangerous? Do people hate you? Is it not? Is it the opposite? Are you kind of considered to be a god in this world? Is it fame? Is it fortune? Right? So all of these advantages and disadvantages will also help you decide how your factions and your parties operate, not just amongst themselves, but how the other people in your world view your political system. And so you really want to kind of take control of that situation ahead of time and figure out what the pluses and minuses are to being in this political system of yours, because that will help you ground down how the rest of the population views your system. And that's a pretty important factor to kind of know ahead of time. And so with that, I mean, there's probably, as always, a lot more, but these are the main things that I think are really important to note and to consider when you're starting to develop this political system of yours and just thinking about politics in general within your world. There high definition points, but they're a good starting point. And even if your story doesn't touch on politics too much, I definitely think you should at least consider some of them, take some notes, figure it out for yourself. You can never know too much about your world. And so it just might be a fun kind of activity to do for yourself so that you are even closer to your story, your little baby, than you already are. So with that, we are going to continue next week and finish off this series with, like I said, economy. And that's going to be our last kind of video in the world building series. And I'll try to think of a different series as well. If you have anything you'd like to know, you'd like for me to do a video on, or a series of videos that has to do with like writing, or I mean, really anything kind of that's around like entrepreneurship. There's a lot of other stuff that I do that isn't just about writing books. So if you want to know about like cover design or anything like that, then definitely comment and let me know, and make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss another one of these videos. And don't forget, if you've been listening along, this Saturday we have another episode of the Witch of Shadows audiobook coming with more chapters, and we're really chugging along through this, so it will be done in no time. I'm so excited to have this whole thing out there. So make sure you stay tuned on Saturday for that. And otherwise, have a great week, a great weekend. I'll see you all next week, and stay magical.